The cold came first before the light. It was the kind that didn't bite but smothered, pressing against your chest until breath turned to glass. We had stopped moving, all of us, crouched in a shallow ditch that had become more grave than trench. The wind didn't howl that morning. It whispered through broken birch like a warning. I remember the sound of fabric stiffening, the quiet crack of ice forming along the barrel of a rifle. No fire, no smoke. Orders had been clear, no light, no flame, no trace. The enemy was close, so close you could hear their metal canteens clink when the wind shifted east. My hands had stopped listening to me hours ago. I rubbed them anyway, the motion more ritual than purpose. We weren't waiting for battle. We were waiting to not freeze before it began. The snow had a texture that morning, soft on the surface, brittle beneath, like the crust of old bread. When I pressed my glove into it, I could feel the emptiness of the earth below. Every sound felt magnified. A distant cough, a shiver, the dull heartbeat of silence. Someone whispered a prayer I didn't recognize. Someone else began tearing strips from a blanket. None of us spoke about why. We had no fire, and yet, somehow, we still believed the dawn would come warm. But that day, it didn't. It came pale, thin, and without promise. And that was when I learned that warmth, like courage, can't always be lit. Cold was not a sensation anymore. It was a presence, a thinking thing. It crept into seams, learned your weak points, and waited. We called it the white. Not snow, not frost, something older. At 30 below, metal burned the skin faster than flame. Breath froze before it hit the ground. We buried our noses into cloth to keep them from splitting open. Some men slept just to feel less of it and never woke again. The real enemy wasn't German or Russian that week. It was time measured by degrees. Every hour without fire was a negotiation with death itself, a test of who could outlast stillness. We'd been told that lighting fires would expose our position. Recon planes patrolled at night, and any flicker meant artillery in the morning. So we learned to vanish. We learned to survive without the very thing that had defined survival since man first stood upright. Our uniforms were layered but thin, designed for movement, not hibernation. The ground stole heat faster than air. Lying down meant dying slow. Standing too long meant your blood pooled and froze your toes first. The white didn't roar. It lulled. It sang of rest, of surrender. Its voice was soft, coaxing you to sit, to lean, to close your eyes. That was the real weapon, the kindness of cold. I remember watching frost crawl along the inside of my sleeve like veins made visible. I remember thinking it looked alive, and in a way, it was. The enemy you never see isn't always across the line. Sometimes, it's already beneath your skin. That night, we stopped trusting warmth. It was January 1942, the outskirts of Stalingrad, though we didn't call it that yet. Just coordinates on a map that felt more myth than place. The Volga was a frozen mirror, stretching wide enough to make men feel smaller than belief itself. We were a supply unit turned infantry, stationed between ruins and emptiness. The rations froze solid. The diesel turned to wax. Even the horses had stopped steaming when they breathed. Command told us to hold position. Hold what, none of us knew. The cold had erased the world into two colors, white and the gray of men trying not to disappear into it. I had been a mechanic before the war. New engines grease the comfort of motion. Out here, everything stopped. Bolts snapped. Leather cracked. Skin became something fragile you wore until it failed. We used to joke that warmth was propaganda, something reserved for headquarters, not for men like us. But beneath that cynicism was fear, the kind that whispered, if the cold wins, no one will know where we fell. There were no birds, no smell of soil, just wind moving through wreckage. That's when one of the men, Petrov, began talking about a trick he'd seen in the Finnish War. Soldiers who stayed warm without flame, without even moving much. We listened, desperate but skeptical. He said it wasn't about fire at all. It was about how the body remembers heat. None of us understood then, but by dawn, we would, and that was the first time I realized survival isn't learned. It's inherited, rediscovered when everything else is taken away. The night stretched into something endless. We took turns stamping our feet, rubbing arms, anything to remind our limbs they belonged to us. Petrov started demonstrating, tearing dry grass from beneath the snow, stuffing it between his outer coat and shirt. "Insulation," he said, as if he were teaching us to build a house out of ourselves. We followed. Anything to feel less brittle. The straw scratched like needles but trapped air, which meant warmth. Others wrapped their feet in newspaper, rubbed cooking oil on their boots to block wind. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The real challenge wasn't just cold. It was stillness. We were afraid to sleep. We told stories, fragments of summers, food, women, the smell of home. Not to comfort, but to create friction in the air. Speech as heat. Our breath hung around us like ghosts. One man cried quietly because his hands wouldn't close anymore. We watched, helpless, too tired to pity. Then came the smell of smoke. Faint, foreign. Somewhere in the distance, another unit had broken orders, lit a fire. The glow flickered against the low clouds, and for a heartbeat, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. But by morning, we found their ashes. That was lesson 1. In this war, warmth was a signal flare for death, so we built our own fire inside. Muscle, memory, motion. I began to understand what Petrov meant. Heat could be stored, traded, disguised. It wasn't just about burning wood. It was about refusing to let the cold own your breath. By the 5th night, something changed. Petrov had been watching the Finns for years, he said. They used a trick called heat banking. We huddled in pairs, chest to back, wrapped our coats together, sealed gaps with cloth. The heat from one man became the heat of 2, a living furnace powered by pulse alone. At first, it felt wrong, intimate, desperate. But then the trembling eased. My heartbeat steadied. The cold was still there, but it no longer ruled. We learned to build shelters half buried in snow. Snow, when packed tight, held warmth better than air. It insulated, not froze. The earth beneath was warmer than the wind above. Always. So we dug. We made hollows, lined them with straw, rags, and memory. When we crawled inside, the silence was thick, but the air was bearable. Some men carried small tin cans under their coats, filled with heated stones from a daytime fire lit far from camp. The stones stayed warm for hours. We called them pocket suns. That night, lying in our snow-dug burrow, I realized the genius wasn't in the materials. It was in the defiance. Fire had always meant life, but here, life had learned to exist without it. For the first time in days, I dreamed, and when I woke, my breath hadn't frozen on my lips. Word spread fast. Units miles apart began using the same methods: grass insulation, shared heat, buried shelters, hot stones wrapped in cloth. Some even warmed water in canteens and carried them inside coats, letting the slow thaw radiate inward. We became architects of endurance. We used body heat strategically, rotating positions in the huddle so no one stayed on the coldest side too long. We learned to move in rhythm, small, silent exercises that kept blood flowing without sound. A kind of ghostly dance between frost and flesh. At dawn, we walked single file through drifts, following the man ahead so our footsteps stayed narrow. It saved effort and heat. The snow that once felt like an enemy began to work for us. It muffled sound, reflected light, and insulated. What had tried to kill us became part of our defense. We found that discipline itself could warm. The order of movement, the trust in a system. It kept panic from spreading, and panic wasted heat faster than the cold ever could. By then, the air smelled different, less of death, more of sweat and damp cloth. It wasn't victory, but it was survival. Deliberate, designed, and shared. And somewhere between breaths, between the stillness and the storm, I realized something simple. Fire was never the miracle. We were What began as field improvisation became doctrine. Notes passed through battalions, across languages, through captured diaries and quiet observation. Engineers studied it later. The idea that snow could preserve heat, that bodies could form thermal cycles stronger than canvas tents. The Soviets adapted it first, creating insulated zemlyankas, dugouts that used the earth itself as armor against winter. Even the enemy learned. By late 43, reports told of German troops copying our methods, burying barrels of warm sand, using felt liners, pairing men at night. The war had forced evolution. After the war, mountain climbers, polar expeditions, even early astronauts borrowed from those lessons. Thermal layering, shared heat management, low oxygen endurance. Techniques born not from science, but desperation. Sometimes survival invents the future. I've seen those same methods in rescue teams now. Foil blankets, body heat transfer, earth shelters. The lineage is invisible but intact, and when I watch young soldiers today, training with synthetic fibers and advanced gear, I still see us, the crude architects of warmth, men who learned that comfort isn't given, it's engineered from will. We didn't win the cold, but we learned to stop fearing it. That was the real victory. One the history books rarely mention. Years later, I learned the physics of what we'd done instinctively. Heat doesn't vanish, it migrates. It seeks equilibrium. By insulating with grass or cloth, we trapped air, nature's best resistor. By burying ourselves in snow, we created a microclimate, a space where body heat could rebound instead of escape. Even our breathing mattered. Exhaling through cloth kept moisture in, preventing frostbite from dehydration. The rhythm of shared breath, two lungs trading warmth, was measurable efficiency. The cold wasn't magic, it was mathematics. But in that war, knowing the formula meant nothing if you couldn't feel it. We became living experiments. Men proving thermodynamics with every heartbeat. I've come to believe that the science was only half the story. The other half was psychology. Belief itself produced warmth. Despair made the body colder, measurable, real. Hope raised temperature. The mind, refusing surrender, rewrote the physics around it. That's something no textbook could ever capture. When I look back now, I see how our greatest discovery wasn't mechanical. It was spiritual. Proof that endurance can substitute for energy, that cooperation can replace combustion. We were human reactors. And even after decades, I still feel that glow when the air turns sharp and the wind bites like memory. It's strange how the cold never truly leaves you. Even in the warmth of modern life, central heating, electric blankets, cities glowing all night, I still sense that silence beneath it all. The memory of still air over endless snow. People talk about resilience now like a slogan. But resilience isn't comfort. It's conversation with suffering. It's learning to stay when every instinct tells you to flee. When the world today faces its own winters, literal or otherwise, I think of those nights without fire. The way we turned to one another instead of away. How warmth became something shared, not owned. That's what kept us alive, not the science, not even the tactics. It was proximity. Proof that human contact could outmatch the physics of loss. I see it echoed in disaster zones, refugee camps, even quiet neighborhoods during power cuts. People pressing closer, trading heat, trading faith. History never repeats, but it rhymes. And its warmest verse is always written in frost. I'm an old man now. The scars on my hands ache when the weather turns, as if the white still calls my name. Sometimes I wake before dawn and sit by a window, watching the dark just before the light. I never light a fire anymore. Habit, maybe. Respect. I think of Petrov, the man who taught us to remember heat. He didn't survive the war. Frost took him the following winter, but his lesson didn't die. It carried on from trench to textbook, from myth to method. Every winter, when the first snow falls, I stand outside for a moment. Let the air sting. Let it remind me. Because what we discovered out there wasn't how to keep warm. It was how to stay human when warmth was gone. The snow has long melted, but that truth endures. We never lit a fire, but somehow we became it. If stories like this remind you what endurance really means, subscribe and keep these lessons alive.